Have you ever thought about how people learned anything way back when? Did you know that for hundreds of years, most of the serious learning, especially in places like schools and churches, happened in a language very few people actually spoke every day? It was Latin, the language of old Rome, and it was everywhere in education during the medieval period, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. But what if we told you that this mighty Latin fortress had some secret doorways? What if the everyday languages of regular people, the ones they spoke at home and in the market, started sneaking into classrooms and scholarly halls? Get ready to explore 7 surprising ways. These everyday languages, called vernaculars, found their way into the very heart of medieval learning. Number 7. The quiet revolution of early vernacular literature. For centuries, if you wanted to be considered truly learned, you had to read, write, and think in Latin. It was the language of scholarship, of the church, and of legal documents across much of Europe. Latin was the high-status language, the one that unlocked ancient wisdom and connected you to the intellectual giants of the past. But while scholars were poring over Latin texts, something amazing was happening outside the monastery walls and university lecture halls. People were starting to write down their stories, their poems, and their histories in the languages they actually spoke. These were the vernacular languages: Old English, Old French, Middle High German, Old Norse, and many others, evolving from Latin or Germanic roots. These vernacular works, at first, were not seen as serious academic material. They were for entertainment, for ballads sung in taverns, for epic tales recited in noble courts, or for practical guides to hunting or farming. They were the stories of heroes like Beowulf in Old English, the chivalrous adventures of Arthur and his knights in French, or the tales of the Nibelungs in German. These were vibrant, living stories that captured the imagination of people far beyond the reach of a Latin grammar school. Yet, over time, a subtle shift began to occur. As these vernacular works grew in number and sophistication, some educators, perhaps even without fully realizing it, began to notice their potential. It was not a sudden declaration that vernacular literature is now part of the curriculum. It was much more subtle than that, a slow, quiet infiltration. One way this happened was through the sheer cultural importance these stories began to carry. A young noble, destined to rule a large estate or lead knights into battle, needed to understand the tales of valor and honor that defined his social class. He would have heard these stories recited by jongleurs or troubadours in his lord's hall, and he might even have had access to manuscripts containing them. A tutor, even one deeply steeped in Latin, would have recognized the value of these stories for instilling moral virtues or illustrating points of rhetoric. For instance, a tutor might use a scene from a vernacular romance, say the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, to discuss the concept of chivalry or the importance of keeping a promise. The tutor would not be teaching the vernacular text as a grammar lesson, but rather as a vehicle for discussing ethical dilemmas or heroic deeds, all of which were important for a young nobleman's education. The discussion itself would often happen in the vernacular, even if the tutor's core instruction was in Latin. Consider a tutor named Master Thomas in 13th century England, employed by a wealthy knight. Master Thomas's main task was to teach young Henry Latin, to prepare him for a possible future in the church or in administration. But Henry also needed to understand the world he lived in. Master Thomas might have, during a break from Cicero, picked up a manuscript of the Lays of Marie de France, written in Anglo-Norman French. He might read aloud a passage describing a difficult choice faced by a character, then turn to Henry and ask in English, "What do you think Sir Launfal should have done there?" This was not a Latin lesson, but a moral lesson. A lesson in critical thinking presented through the medium of a vernacular story. The very act of reading or discussing such a text even informally validated the language in a way that had not existed before. Another subtle avenue was through the sheer beauty and persuasive power of the vernacular. As vernacular literature developed, it became incredibly rich in its own right. Poets and storytellers honed their craft, creating works that were eloquent, moving, and structurally complex. Some Latin scholars, perhaps initially dismissive, might have found themselves impressed by the rhetorical flourishes or the depth of emotion expressed in a vernacular poem. They might not have openly praised it in a lecture hall, but in private conversations they might have acknowledged its power. This quiet appreciation could lead to small, unrecorded shifts in teaching. Perhaps a teacher, struggling to explain a concept of allegory or metaphor to a Latin class, might reach for a simple, well-known vernacular fable or folktale as an illustration. Instead of just relying on classical examples, they might say, "It's like the tale of the fox and the crow in our own tongue, where the fox's flattery blinds the crow to the danger." This was not a formal study of the vernacular text, but its incidental use as a clearer, more accessible example for students struggling with Latin abstractions. The familiarity of the vernacular made the abstract concept more concrete. Old-school records from some German monasteries in the 14th century, for example, show marginal notes in Latin grammar books that occasionally refer to local proverbs or folk sayings in German to illustrate a point about grammar or syntax. This suggests an implicit recognition of the vernacular's utility even within a Latin-dominated environment. The rise of chronicles and histories written in vernacular also played a part. While the grand histories were often in Latin, local histories, family lineages, and accounts of specific battles or reigns began to appear in English, French, or German. For a student learning about their own kingdom's past, these vernacular histories were often more immediate and engaging than dry Latin chronicles. A tutor might assign a student to read a passage from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in Old English, not for its linguistic value but for its historical content, even if the main historical instruction was still in Latin. This was a practical concession to the reality that important information was increasingly being recorded in the common tongue. The students, in turn, were quietly getting more exposure to reading and understanding their own language in a more formal context than just casual conversation. Even for aspiring scribes and clerks, there was a quiet, practical need for vernacular proficiency. While legal documents and church records were primarily in Latin, increasingly local administrative records, guild rules, and town charters were being written in the local language. A scribe trained only in Latin would find himself unable to fully participate in the burgeoning administrative world outside the church. So, while a formal school might not have had a vernacular writing class, the very necessity of the job meant that scribes had to develop their skills in it. This was often done through apprenticeship, but even within formal schooling, there might have been subtle encouragement to practice writing in the vernacular for practical purposes, such as copying letters or keeping household accounts. Practical application of vernacular writing became an unspoken part of a well-rounded education for those entering secular professions. This gradual acceptance of vernacular literature, even in a supporting role, was a testament to its growing power and influence. It was not about replacing Latin, but about acknowledging that these other languages, once considered crude or simple, now carried stories, ideas, and information that were too important to ignore. The quiet revolution was not a loud protest, but a gentle, steady seep, where the rich tapestry of vernacular expression began to weave itself into the edges of the Latin-dominated educational landscape. Students were not just learning about Latin. They were increasingly learning through and with the help of their own mother tongue, even if it was rarely formally acknowledged. This set the stage for later, more explicit inclusions of vernacular study, but it started with these subtle nods to the cultural and practical importance of the languages spoken every day. Number 6. Noble nurseries, learning in the Lord's household. When people think of medieval education, they often picture monks in cold stone monasteries or scholars debating in dusty university halls. And yes, much of the formal learning certainly happened in those places almost exclusively in Latin. But a whole different kind of education was happening in parallel, largely outside the formal church-run institutions, the education of noble children within their own households. These noble nurseries, as we can call them, were often bustling places, and the education provided there had a distinct flavor, one that significantly favored the vernacular languages. Noble children, particularly boys destined for knighthood or high office, did not always start their education in a monastery or a grammar school. Often they were educated at home, or, as was common for pages and squires, sent to the household of a higher-ranking lord or lady. Here, the emphasis was not just on academic learning in the Latin tradition, but on a broad set of skills essential for their future roles: martial arts, horsemanship, etiquette, administration of estates, and, crucially, the ability to read and write for practical purposes. For these young nobles, the immediate need was to understand the world around them, to communicate with their tenants, to read and write letters concerning land, trade, or alliances. And these everyday communications were happening not in Latin, but in the regional vernacular. A young lord needed to read a message from a neighboring baron written in French, or understand a land deed in English. A young lady needed to manage a large household which involved keeping accounts, ordering supplies, and communicating with servants all in the common tongue. So, while a Latin tutor might be present to teach the basics of grammar and perhaps some religious texts in Latin, a significant portion of their literacy development happened directly in the vernacular. Their first books were often not Latin grammars, but chivalric romances, epic poems, or practical guides written in their own language. Imagine a young heir to a powerful estate in 14th century France. His tutor, perhaps a cleric or a literate knight, would certainly instruct him in Latin for prayers and perhaps basic theology. Just as much, the tutor would have him read aloud from the Roman de la Rose, a popular French poem, or from the Lancelot Grail cycle. These were not just for entertainment, they taught moral lessons, social graces, and the ideals of knighthood, all within the framework of their own language. The language of these stories became the language of learning about their identity and their future roles. These noble nurseries often had practical copybooks or guides to letter writing in the vernacular. A young noble would be taught how to draft a letter to a neighboring lord, how to write an inventory of goods, or how to pen a request to the king's court. These exercises were entirely in the vernacular because that was the language of the everyday world of governance and management they were expected to enter. A document from a 15th century English noble household describes the education of a young ward, mentioning specifically his practice in writing letters in English and casting accounts. This shows a clear practical application of vernacular literacy. Even when Latin was taught, the instruction often relied heavily on the vernacular. Tutor would explain Latin vocabulary or grammar rules using the student's mother tongue. A phrase in Horace might be translated line by line into English or French, not just as a linguistic exercise, but as the primary way of understanding the text's meaning. The vernacular acted as the bridge, the medium of instruction, even when the subject was Latin itself. This contrasted with some more formal grammar schools, where the direct method of Latin-only instruction was sometimes attempted. In the noble household, practicality often trumped strict adherence to Latin-only pedagogy. For young noble women, the vernacular was even more dominant. Their education, often focused on household management, religious devotion, and social graces, rarely involved the deep dive into Latin grammar that boys might experience. They learned to read prayer books and devotional texts, many of which were translated into vernacular languages for personal piety. They learned to read and write letters, manage accounts, and perhaps even read vernacular chronicles and romances for their own entertainment and moral instruction. The famous Book of the Knight of Latour Landry, a moral guide for his daughters from the late 14th century, was written in French and widely circulated. This was a direct educational text, clearly designed for vernacular use in noble households. Presence of scribes and secretaries within noble households also fostered vernacular literacy. These professionals, while often skilled in Latin, spent much of their time drafting and copying documents in the local language. Young nobles would observe this work and often participate in it, learning by doing. They would learn the conventions of vernacular writing, not just in theory, but through the practical application of preparing official letters, inventories, or household ledgers. The need for clear, accurate communication in the vernacular for the daily running of a powerful estate was undeniable. So while the formal academic world was largely Latin-centric, the world of the nobility, driven by practical needs and the burgeoning literary culture of vernacular languages, created a significant parallel educational track. In these noble nurseries, the vernacular was not just a secondary language, it was often the primary language of learning for practical skills, cultural understanding, and even moral instruction. This meant that a generation of future leaders and administrators were growing up fluent and literate in their own languages, quietly strengthening the position of vernaculars as legitimate languages of learning and knowledge, even if not yet in the highest academic circles. This laid a subtle but firm foundation for future developments, showing that serious learning and practical knowledge could in fact thrive outside the ancient tongue of Latin. Number 5. The vernacular sermon and catechism as educational tools. When you think about the medieval church, you probably picture grand cathedrals and solemn Latin masses. And you would be right, for the liturgy, the formal prayers and rituals, was indeed almost entirely in Latin. However, the church had a massive challenge: how to teach its doctrines, moral lessons, and basic Christian principles to the vast majority of the population who spoke no Latin at all. The answer to this problem led directly to one of the most significant ways vernacular languages crept into education, particularly within the church itself: to sermons and catechism. The sermon was the primary way the clergy communicated directly with the common people. After the Latin Mass, the priest would step forward and preach a sermon in the local language. This was not just a casual talk, it was a carefully crafted lesson, intended to explain biblical stories, Christian dogma, moral behavior, and the meaning of the sacraments. For many ordinary people, the Sunday sermon was their main source of education about the world, their faith, and how they should live. For the church, this meant that its priests and friars needed to be exceptionally good at speaking in the vernacular. While their formal theological training was in Latin, they had to be able to translate complex theological concepts into simple, understandable terms for their congregants. This skill was not just about speaking. It was about rhetoric, about storytelling, about explaining, and about engaging an audience. So, within the seminaries and monastic schools that trained clergy, there was an implicit and sometimes explicit focus on developing vernacular communication skills. Imagine a young Dominican friar in 13th century Paris, fresh from his Latin studies. He would be sent out to preach to the local villagers or townspeople. He could not stand up and deliver a sermon in Latin. No one would understand him. Instead, he would have to master French. His superiors would likely provide him with collections of model sermons, often written in Latin, but specifically designed to be translated and adapted for a vernacular audience. The process of translating these sermons, or even just preparing to deliver them effectively, was a significant educational exercise in vernacular language. He would learn to choose appropriate vocabulary, to construct clear sentences, and to use vivid imagery that resonated with his listeners, all in the common tongue. Furthermore, The Church developed catechisms, basic instructional texts that laid out the core tenets of the faith, like the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed. While early catechisms might have been Latin, the pressing need to instruct the laity led to their widespread translation and dissemination in vernacular languages. These vernacular catechisms became fundamental educational tools. Parish priests were expected to teach these to their congregations, especially to children and new converts. This meant the priests themselves had to be fluent in these vernacular versions, and often copies of these vernacular catechisms were used in the religious instruction within local schools or even noble households. For example, a parish priest in 14th century Germany might possess a vernacular catechism. Perhaps a handwritten copy or a printed version if he was very fortunate. He would use this to teach the children of his parish. He might gather them in the church or in a simple village schoolroom and go through the lessons explaining in German the meaning of Our Father or the details of the creation story. This was formal instruction, led by the church directly in the vernacular. The children were learning to read and understand theological concepts not through Latin, but through the language they spoke every day. The very act of writing these vernacular sermons and catechisms also had an impact. While scholars debated in Latin, preachers and reformers began to produce theological treatises, moral guides, and devotional literature directly in vernacular languages. Figures like John Wycliffe in England or John Hus in Bohemia, often seen as precursors to the Reformation, actively promoted the use of vernacular scripture and theological writing. Their followers, in turn, produced and copied these texts, further solidifying the use of vernaculars for serious religious thought, even if the mainstream church initially resisted. Even within formal church education, students destined for the priesthood might have had lessons on how to compose effective sermons. While the theoretical framework might be discussed in Latin, the practical exercises would involve drafting and practicing sermons in the vernacular. They would learn how to use rhetorical devices in their own tongue, how to structure an argument that resonated with an unlettered audience, and how to tell a compelling story. This was an education in practical vernacular communication, directly sanctioned and necessitated by the Church's mission. Church records, such as bishops' directives or synodal decrees, sometimes explicitly stated the requirement for clergy to preach and instruct in the vernacular. For instance, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a hugely important church council, decreed that bishops should provide suitable men to preach and instruct the people, recognizing the need for communication in the local languages. This official recognition, though not directly about formal school curricula, certainly put pressure on clerical training to ensure fluency and rhetorical skill in the vernacular. Church understood that to effectively control and guide the souls of Europe, it had to speak to them in their own language. This pragmatic necessity led to a quiet but significant integration of vernacular languages into the very fabric of clerical education, ensuring that those who led the spiritual lives of millions were masters of the common tongue. Number 4. Beyond the monastic walls, urban schools and market needs. For a long time, the dominant centers of education in medieval Europe were monasteries and cathedrals. These institutions primarily served the Church, training future monks, priests, and scholars, and Latin was their undisputed king. But as the medieval period progressed, especially from the 12th century onwards, something new was happening. Towns and cities were growing. These urban centers became hubs of trade, craftsmanship, and administration, and they had a different kind of educational need. This led to the rise of urban schools, often independent of direct church control, which played a crucial role in bringing vernacular languages into the educational landscape. People populating these growing towns were not primarily destined for the clergy. They were merchants, artisans, lawyers, scribes, and administrators. They needed to be able to read and write, not just for religious purposes, but for practical everyday business. A merchant needed to keep accounts, write letters to suppliers and customers, and understand contracts. An artisan needed to read instructions, keep records of materials, and manage apprentices. A town clerk needed to record council meetings, draft civic ordinances, and handle property deeds. And almost all of these practical communications were happening in the local vernacular. So, urban schools began to emerge, often funded by guilds, town councils, or wealthy individuals. These civic schools, or town schools, had a curriculum that reflected the practical needs of their students, while Latin was still often taught. Particularly for those aiming for university or higher legal professions, vernacular literacy was given much more emphasis than in traditional monastic schools. Imagine a busy town in 14th century Italy, a place like Florence or Siena. Young boys, and sometimes girls, from merchant families would attend a school of abacus, or a writing school. Primary goal here was not to master Cicero's prose, but to learn to read, write, and calculate in the Tuscan dialect that was spoken in the marketplace. They would learn arithmetic for trade, the art of letter writing for business correspondence, and how to record transactions and ledgers. These skills were directly applicable to the burgeoning commercial world. Old Florentine school records from the 14th century indicate that a significant portion of students were learning to read in volgare, Italian vernacular, and to write accounts. This was not just a side activity. It was a central part of their instruction. These schools used teaching materials that reflected their practical focus. Instead of solely relying on Latin texts, they would use vernacular examples of business letters, contracts, and accounting documents. Teacher might dictate a letter in the local dialect for students to copy, focusing on proper address, clear language, and correct phonating, all in the vernacular. Students would practice writing out sums, inventories, and receipts, honing their literacy in the language of commerce. Guilds, powerful organizations of craftsmen and merchants, often played a direct role in this. They needed literate members to manage their affairs, record apprenticeships, and enforce regulations. Some guilds even established their own schools or paid for their members' children to attend schools that emphasized practical vernacular skills. For a young apprentice, being able to read instructions for a complex piece of equipment or to keep a ledger of materials was as vital as learning the trade itself. The apprenticeship system, while primarily hands-on, often incorporated basic literacy training, frequently in the vernacular, for these practical purposes. The rise of town clerks and notaries also spurred vernacular education. These professionals who drafted and maintained public records needed to be highly skilled in both Latin and the local vernacular. They were the bridge between formal Latin legalities and the everyday language of the people. Schools, training, future notaries and clerks would have included extensive practice in drafting documents in the vernacular, ensuring clarity and precision in the common tongue for official purposes. Collections of model vernacular legal documents or administrative forms were used as teaching aids, showing students how to structure deeds, wills, and contracts in their own language. Even in schools that still taught Latin as a core subject, the teaching methods adapted to the needs of the town students. Teachers, knowing that many students would not pursue a clerical career, might use vernacular as the primary language of instruction to explain Latin grammar and vocabulary. The goal was to get students to a functional level of Latin quickly, often using the vernacular as the main bridge rather than aiming for deep classical scholarship. The growth of urban centers created a new demand for a different kind of literacy, one rooted in the practical necessities of trade, administration, and civic life. These urban schools, driven by market needs rather than solely religious aims, became crucial incubators for vernacular education. They legitimized the use of local languages in the classroom for serious practical learning. showing that literacy was not just for monks and scholars, but for merchants and citizens too. This shift, slowly but surely, brought vernacular languages from the streets and markets directly into the medieval schoolroom, preparing a new generation for a world increasingly reliant on their own mother tongues. Number 3. The bridge language in beginners' classrooms. Imagine being a child in medieval Europe, say in the 12th century. You grow up speaking your local dialect of French, German, or English at home. Your world is filled with sounds and words you understand. Then one day you are sent to school, perhaps a small parish school or the grammar school attached to a monastery, and suddenly you are confronted with Latin. It's an entirely different language, with different sounds, different words, and a very different grammar. How did medieval teachers bridge this massive linguistic gap for beginners who had no prior knowledge of Latin? This is where vernacular languages began to creep in as an essential bridge language in beginners' classrooms. For centuries, the ideal method of teaching Latin was often the direct method, or immersion. The idea was to speak Latin exclusively in the classroom, forcing students to learn through context and imitation, much like how a child learns its first language. This method worked best for those who started very young, or those in environments where Latin was spoken regularly, like some monastic communities. But for the vast majority of students entering school, especially those from non-clerical families, this was simply not practical. They arrived knowing no Latin at all. Faced with this reality, teachers, often pragmatic and resourceful, found themselves relying heavily on the student's mother tongue to explain Latin concepts. It was not a formal policy change. It was a necessity for effective teaching. A teacher would introduce a new Latin word, say domus, for house. Instead of simply pointing to a house and repeating domus, the teacher would say in the local vernacular, domus means house, like the house you live in. This direct translation, simple as it seems, was a fundamental way vernacular language entered the classroom. Consider the example of a schoolmaster in 13th century England. Master John, he stands before a group of young boys. He wants to teach them the Latin word for table, which is mensa. He points to a table and says, mensa. But he immediately follows up with, that is, board in your English, using the Middle English word for table. This constant cross-referencing, translating Latin words and phrases into the student's known language, was absolutely essential for comprehension. Students were not just learning Latin words, they were learning their Latin equivalents through their vernacular. Grammar was even more challenging. Latin grammar is complex with cases, declensions, and conjugations that have few direct parallels in many developing vernaculars. How do you explain the concept of a dative case or a subjunctive mood to a child who has never encountered such grammatical structures? Teachers would explain these rules using the vernacular. They might say in French, when you want to say to the boy or for the boy, you use the dative case in Latin, like puro, not just pour. The entire explanation of the Latin grammatical rule, its function and its form, would be delivered in the student's native language. Many surviving medieval Latin grammar books, like the famous Doctrinale of Alexander de Viade, were written entirely in Latin. However, marginal notes and glosses in these very books, added by students or teachers over the centuries, tell a different story. These notes often contain vernacular translations of difficult Latin words, or brief explanations of grammatical rules in the local language. This is strong evidence that even though the textbook was Latin, the actual teaching and understanding process involved constant vernacular mediation. It was a kind of secret language of instruction, woven into the very pages of the Latin texts. A student might write horse next to the Latin word equus, or he loves, next to amat, clearly using their mother tongue to unlock the meaning of the ancient language. Dialogue exercises were also common in medieval schools, designed to teach conversational Latin, but even these often contained vernacular translations or instructions. For instance, a Latin dialogue might have parallel vernacular versions in the margin, or the teacher would use the vernacular to set up the scene or explain the meaning of the Latin phrases being practiced. Now I will say this in Latin, and you must answer me in Latin. I will ask, "Quid aegis?" which means, "How are you?" in our own tongue. The vernacular provided the context and the key to understanding the Latin. This widespread use of vernacular as a bridge language was not about celebrating the vernacular itself, but a pragmatic acknowledgement of its necessity. Teachers were not trying to promote English or German. They were trying to teach Latin effectively. But in doing so, they inadvertently gave vernacular languages a crucial role within the very heart of the Latin classroom. Students were constantly moving between the two languages, translating, comparing, and using their mother tongue as a mental tool to grasp the intricacies of Latin. This constant interplay ensured that vernacular languages, far from being excluded, became an indispensable, if often unacknowledged, part of the medieval educational experience, particularly for beginners. It showed that even the most Latin-focused education could not entirely escape the everyday language of its students. Number 2. Parental push and the demand for practical swells. For centuries, education in medieval Europe was largely controlled by the church. If you went to school, you were probably being trained for a role within the clergy, and that meant a heavy dose of Latin. But as society evolved, especially from the High Middle Ages onwards, a new force began to influence education. Parents, particularly those from the rising merchant class and gentry, started to demand a different kind of learning for their children. They wanted practical skills, and these practical skills often meant learning in the vernacular. These parents were not necessarily aiming for their children to become priests or monks. They wanted their sons to manage estates, conduct trade, enter legal professions, or work in town administration. They wanted their daughters to run large households, manage accounts, and communicate effectively. For these life paths, a deep classical Latin education was often seen as less important than the ability to read and write in the everyday language of business and society. Consider a prosperous merchant family in 13th century Flanders. The father, a shrewd businessman, understands that his sons need to be able to read invoices, write business letters to counterparts in other towns, and keep meticulous financial ledgers. All of these activities were increasingly conducted in Flemish or French, not Latin. He would seek out a school or a tutor who could provide this kind of practical literacy. He might even negotiate with a school to emphasize these skills. He wouldn't necessarily object to Latin, but his primary concern would be his son's ability to conduct future business successfully in the vernacular. Records from urban areas, particularly from Italian cities like Florence or Venice, clearly show this demand. There were schools of abacus and writing schools specifically catering to children of merchants. These schools taught arithmetic, accounting, and letter writing, predominantly in the local Italian vernacular. The very existence of such schools, separate from the traditional Latin grammar schools, is a strong indicator of a parental push for practical vernacular-based education. These were not just informal lessons. They were structured educational institutions, responding directly to market demand. Old records of these schools from Florence in the 14th century show thousands of children attending, many of whom were learning to read and write in the vernacular for practical purposes. For girls, this parental push was even more pronounced. While formal Latin education was rare for girls, parents desired them to be literate enough to manage a household, read devotional texts, and perhaps manage family correspondence. These skills were almost exclusively developed through vernacular literacy. A wealthy noble family might hire a governess or tutor to teach their daughters to read prayer books and moral guides, many of which were translated into vernacular languages specifically for female readers. The Book of the Knight of La Tour Landry, a collection of moral tales written in French for his daughters in the late 14th century, is a perfect example of educational material driven by parental desire for vernacular instruction. The rise of legal professions also contributed to this demand. While core law texts were in Latin, the everyday practice of law involved drafting deeds, wills, contracts, and communicating with clients, all of which increasingly happened in the vernacular. Parents who wanted their sons to become lawyers or notaries would seek education that prepared them for this dual linguistic reality. They needed not only Latin for the legal principles, but also precise, clear vernacular for their daily work. So, schools that trained future legal professionals often incorporated extensive practice in vernacular legal writing. Even in schools that primarily taught Latin, the pressure from parents could lead to a subtle shift in emphasis. If parents were paying for their child's education, their wishes carried weight. A schoolmaster might find it necessary to spend more time on vernacular reading and writing exercises, or to use the vernacular more extensively as a teaching tool, simply to satisfy the expectations of the families supporting the school. This pragmatic approach meant that vernacular skills, even if not explicitly part of the official curriculum, became a de facto part of the learning experience. This parental push was a powerful external force that nudged medieval education away from its purely Latin clerical focus. It highlighted the growing importance of vernacular languages, not just for casual conversation, but for the serious business of making a living, managing a household, and participating in the evolving social and economic life of the medieval world. It showed educators that there was a significant practical demand for literacy in the common tongue, and that meeting this demand was essential for the future of their students and for society as a whole. This practical parent-driven demand significantly contributed to the slow, steady integration of vernaculars into medieval learning, demonstrating their utility and necessity far beyond the walls of the monastery. Number 1. The secret lives of glossaries and interlinear translations. If you could peer into a medieval classroom, or even into the study of a lonely scholar, you would likely see books, lots of books. And these books, for the most part, would be written in Latin. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might notice something fascinating. These Latin texts were not always pristine. They were often filled with scribbles, notes, and tiny words, crammed into the margins or written between the lines of text. These were glosses and interlinear translations, and they represent one of the most direct, intimate, and surprising ways vernacular languages began to creep into medieval education. A gloss is a brief explanation or definition of a difficult word or phrase. An interlinear translation is exactly what it sounds like: a translation of a Latin word or phrase written directly above or below it in another language. These weren't always official additions by the original scribe of the manuscript. More often, they were added by students struggling with the Latin or by teachers trying to make the Latin more understandable for their pupils. And the language of these glosses and translations, often it was the vernacular. Imagine a young student in 10th century Anglo-Saxon England. He is trying to read a Latin psalm. He comes across the word caelum, heaven. He might not recognize it, or he might confuse it with a similar sounding word. To help himself, or perhaps instructed by his teacher, he carefully writes hofen, the Old English word for heaven, directly above caelum in his manuscript. This simple act is profound. It's a direct physical manifestation of the vernacular entering the learning process, right there on the sacred Latin page. These glosses were not just scattered notes. They often formed extensive systematic aids to understanding. In some manuscripts, particularly biblical texts or important classical works, There are entire sections where almost every Latin word has an accompanying vernacular gloss. These interlinear glossaries, or vernacular glosses, were essentially the medieval equivalent of modern foreign language textbooks, where the target language is presented with direct translations. They acted as a living, dynamic dictionary and grammar guide, created by generations of students and teachers trying to bridge the linguistic gap. For example, the famous Rushworth Gospels and the Lindisfarne Gospels are Old English interlinear glosses of Latin texts. These are not just isolated words. They are almost complete translations written between the lines of the Latin. While these might have been for specific scholarly or devotional purposes initially, their very existence speaks to the need to access and understand Latin texts through the vernacular. Students studying these texts would constantly encounter the Latin alongside its vernacular equivalent, reinforcing the connection between the two languages. Teachers would also use these techniques in the classroom. Instead of simply dictating Latin, they might dictate a Latin phrase and then immediately provide its vernacular equivalent for students to write down. Or, when a student stumbled over a Latin word, the teacher would provide the vernacular translation. The students would then write these translations into their own copies of the texts, building up their personal glossaries. This informal, ad hoc approach created a vast, unrecorded educational practice where vernacular was the indispensable key to unlocking Latin. The process was circular. Students would add glosses to their books. These glossed books would then be passed down or copied. Later students would learn from the existing glosses and add their own, sometimes correcting or refining previous ones. This created a cumulative body of vernacular linguistic data embedded within Latin texts. These glosses show us, centuries later, exactly which Latin words and phrases were difficult for medieval speakers of Old High German, Old Irish, Old French, or other vernaculars. They reveal the specific linguistic hurdles and how they were overcome using the mother tongue. The significance of these glosses and interlinear translations cannot be overstated. They were not formal curricula or official decrees. They were the organic, grassroots way that vernacular languages became integrated into the very core of medieval learning. They served as a practical, everyday tool for comprehension, a lifeline for students drowning in the complexities of Latin. They prove that even when Latin was the sole language of instruction on paper, in reality, the classroom was a bilingual space where the vernacular was constantly present, helping to make sense of the ancient tongue. These humble scribbles in the margins were quiet revolutionaries, demonstrating the inescapable presence and increasing utility of vernacular languages in the process of acquiring knowledge during the medieval period. They were the secret language of learning hidden in plain sight.